First, Exequiel, I think it's a very nice analytical framework. Um, Not that you said something that was not known before, but I think to put it together and to try to reconcile elements from all four traditions, it's theoretically nice, and I think it tells an interesting story. So it's a contribution, and it's an interesting way for for international relations person to do. One comment from before I go to the Middle East. One comment from perspective of somebody who has sometimes skeptical attitude towards international relations and the theories that being run there. I think you miss, as somebody who is more historian looking, I think that you miss the very important category of personality and the specific historical circumstances that make success or failure of the push towards nuclear weapon-free zone. I think in each of the zones that were successful, there were one or more individuals who their story is identified with the story of the nuclear weapon-free zone, and their personality, their effort were critical for the establishment, for the diplomatic it's a diplomatic exercise. And you need, there are various kind of stakeholders and you need to move them. And in all the cases, in particular Latin America, as you mentioned, but in others, there were individuals who were involved. In the absence of individuals, it would be much more difficult, not necessarily impossible. It will need just a set of bureaucrats. So I think you need to have some kind of reference or category about the individuals. I think that very often individuals are much more important.
Yes, I can respond it now. Actually, I address it in my paper because in my dissertation, regional powers also are related to the personalities that are in charge of that powers. In some cases, of course, I address the role of individuals. In the case of Latin America, I address the case of the Garcia Robles, the father of the Tlatelolco Treaty. He was a kind of a norm entrepreneur, and he made an outstanding contribution to the non-proliferation field. He was a personality in itself. He was awarded the Peace Nobel Prize in the 80s. And also I addressed the role of David Lange and Robert Hawke, the Prime Minister of both New Zealand and Australia. They were very important figures. For instance, David Lange, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, challenged the US in the nuclear field. He forbid the passage of nuclear vessels in New Zealand. So yes,
I think it's separate. I mean, when you talk, especially with realists, about regional powers and all that, people look as if abstractly as if we talk about the entities called states and you talk about interests of states. I think it's important to have a separate category to talk about individuals in the role of region. That's, I think analytically that's not it. About the Middle East, I think the story is simple. Ultimately, one, not only that those conditions are not being met there, one country, Israel, wants to keep monopoly. That country loves to have nuclear weapons in the way that they have nuclear weapons, so semi-opaque, and they would like to keep it that way. They're not ready in any way, they don't see any way, and this is the country that dominates the area in this field, and obviously they don't see that there is any need for them to give up the monopoly. They want only to enhance monopoly. They wouldn't allow anybody else to have that kind of, so there is no any pressure on them from security in any other way, and their interest is to keep that kind of opaque monopoly. So there is no any interest. I mean, all this talk that goes on is lip service for international organization, for the UN, for various kind of players, but seriously, substantially, there is no any interest in that because one country has it and they're not ready to give it up under any circumstances. Simple and clear.
No, I agree with you. That's the reason why in contrast to other regions, Middle Eastern countries cannot think that their security is best suited by regional security arrangements.
Yeah, but they wouldn't talk about regional countries. It's one country who dominates on the nuclear issue, the region. It believes that it has power, realistic power, to dominate the region, and it's not ready to move into diplomacy on this issue that it sees politically it's also important.
It's true, but again, the region, the Middle East, doesn't have any security regime, even in other fields. For instance, the Middle East was incapable to deal with the Syrian civil war. So actually, Middle Eastern countries don't cooperate in security. Maybe in the case of the Gulf Cooperation Council, you see some kind of security cooperation there, but not in the broad Middle East. You don't have security frameworks. That is problematic. And you don't have cooperation.
Historically, there were ad hoc-ish security framework. I mean, for example, the Lebanese civil war was stopped because of some the Taif agreement that Saudi Arabia broke in the 80s. So ad hoc-ish there were issues that there were agreements on some issues, including ceasefire lines and all of that kind of things over the time. I agree with you. There is no regime. There is no security regime.
Yes, and the level of cooperation in other fields in the Middle East, including trade, is very low. It's the lowest in the world. So there is an article that I really like it. I like also the title. The Middle East is a region without regionalism. So we can discuss also if the Middle East is a region. Even.
Who wrote the article?
The family name is Art. I can send you
So my question kind of goes back to your, I guess, analytical approach. I'm not quite clear on the role of the the realist conditions and what role that serves in the analysis.
Well,
I just noticed it's a little bit different between them.
Yes, realist conditions, I mean the prudential realism of T.V. Paul, that for T.V. Paul, or for this tradition, the best way to deal with if there are security threats in the region, instead, for a prudential point of view, the best way to deal with this threat is to establish security regimes. So if regions value security, common security, they will prefer to establish a regime instead of proliferating.
Okay, because arguably some of the realist conditions then, I mean, depending on what perspective you take, you could argue that from a certain state's point of view that proliferating would be the better option. But I mean, I'd have to go into the details and look back into it, but that's just my understanding.
Yeah, for the regions that establish these regimes, yes, proliferation is a costly option. So the less costly option is to establish a regime. That's the logic behind the prudential realism.
So I'm noticing in your analytical framework, you weren't able to draw many lessons from the liberal tradition. And it seems like in a lot of your cases, you mentioned that there's not solid democracies in the region. And I'm wondering if are you too narrowly defining this liberal tradition to only mean the role that democracies played in the region as opposed to the role that other institutions may have played? I don't understand. Yeah. So
okay.
Comment on such as what other institutions?
Maybe some like nuclear cooperation between countries, for example, in maybe Latin America, nuclear cooperation between countries that is sort of this liberal institutionalist approach, but not democracy as such.
Well, the three pillars of the liberal tradition are based on the Kantian triangle. There is an article of on the Kantian triangle. That is the role of democracy, the role of economic interdependence, and the role of regional organizations. That's what I define by liberal conditions. And regarding democracy, it's very hard to assess the role of democracy, because what these regions show is that authoritarian regimes can cooperate in arms control. They can create security organizations and frameworks. And also regarding the economic interdependence and regional organizations, again, if a region has a very strong regional tradition, there is cooperation, there is trade, in the end, this will have a positive spillover on security matters. For instance, the nuclear rapprochement between Argentina and Brazil. The nuclear rapprochement was against the backdrop of economic cooperation between both countries. They established the Mercosur, the main economic organization, at the same time that they established the bilateral safeguard agreement. So there is a spillover effect. That is lacking in the Middle East.
Yeah, but what he's saying, and I think that he's right, that could be somewhat independent of the issue of democracy. So the rise of various kinds of institutions to either bilateral or multilateral to arrange more cooperation, either in the nuclear issue or larger than trade and others, that could be independent of questions of democracy, or could be not directly related to the question of democracy. And I think that he has a point that the notion of the liberal institutional approach should be larger than just democracy.
So I have a kind of question about future prospects for new zones.
Yeah.
And looking at kind of how you can break down current zones in terms of, I think you can say that there are preventative zones like Latin America and Rarotonga and South Pacific that were established as kind of barriers to proliferation to make sure countries like Argentina and Brazil do not acquire nuclear weapons capabilities. Or you have kind of retroactive zones like Pelindaba or Central Asia, which made sure that South Africa and the other Central Asian states didn't perhaps obtain again nuclear weapons. So I think at their core, nuclear weapon-free zones are kind of confidence-building measures. They're not exactly active arms control agreements. So you've never had a zone where it's established when nuclear weapons are in the region. So I'm wondering how the model we have now can be mapped onto regions like the Middle East, like Northeast Asia, like South Asia, where there are actual nuclear weapons, and that it will require an actual disarmament process.
Well, that's what I raised at the end for the debate. I think that we have to discuss if the nuclear weapons-free zone model is suitable for the Middle East, because of the scope conditions and because of the mechanism itself. Maybe it's not suitable for the Middle East. I agree with you. We have to develop another proposal for the Middle East. But again, to some extent, nuclear weapons-free zones are more than confidence-building measures. Are non-proliferation and arms control mechanisms. For instance, in the case of Argentina and Brazil, they joined the nuclear weapons-free zone in the 90s. They ratified the 90s. They ratified the Tlatelolco Treaty in the 90s. In order, yes, after or in parallel, they solved the nuclear issue. So for them, these regimes were. This regime was arms control mechanism, I guess.
other questions from the audience? I'll ask one question. Nobody has any questions. Thank you so much. I agree with Avna that it was a really nice analysis, very structured, and I'm sure it took a lot of literature review and time to put together this. And maybe that's for the future debate, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted last year. Have you looked at it and how it can help, maybe? The Treaty on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted in 2017. Did you look at that treaty and how it could play a role in the emergence of new security regimes?
It have on the Middle East.
Just in general, like, I mean, did you look at it?
Yes. Well, in the case of the Middle East, again, regional solutions for regional power problems have to come from the young region. I don't believe that international pressure or incentives can play any meaningful role in the case of the Middle East. We have the case of what happened in the 90s. Both the US and the European Union sponsor cooperative programs in the Middle East, such as the MENA conferences and the Barcelona process. Why? Because the rationale behind these programs was that if Middle Eastern countries cooperate, they will start cooperating in security issues. The rationale is okay. It's what I present in my paper, in my presentation. But the problem what happened in the 90s is that these initiatives came from abroad. Regional initiatives, to be legitimate, have to come from the own region. And I don't know, I don't see a new treaty like the ban of nuclear weapons in the near future. I don't know, it will take years. We have also the case of the CTBT, that it was approved 20 years ago and we're still waiting for its entry into force.
Questions? So once again, thank you so much for your great presentation.